Tienes que
A
poner tu
los...
micrófono. Ahí.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por asistir a este cuarto sesión de seminarios en los cuales hemos estado estudiando procesos constituyentes en democracia. Vimos primero el caso de Colombia, enseguida el caso de Sudáfrica. La semana pasada estuvimos con España y esta semana vamos a estudiar el caso de Irlanda. Antes de eso, permítame darles que el sitio Lexen Constitución 2022.cl está ganando cada día más contenido. Hemos ido agregando algunas entrevistas, son entrevistas muy interesantes, largas y contundentes a actores en particular económicos relevantes. Esta semana vamos a subir las entrevistas a Fernando Atria y a Juan Andrés Fonten, de manera que se suman a las 6 entrevistas que ya están hoy día disponibles, más papers, documentos y traducciones de documentos que van a poder, incluso un resumen en español para que lo puedan ir estudiando quienes les parezca. Como les decía, hoy día vamos a estudiar el caso del proceso constituyente irlandés. Y para ello contamos con la presencia muy destacada de la profesora Rachel Walsh. Ella es profesora del Trinity College en Dublín, desde donde nos va a hablar hoy día. Ella es una experta en temas constitucionales, en temas de propiedad, pero lo más interesante desde nuestra perspectiva, probablemente, dentro de las muchas que ella pues, tiene para ofrecer, es que ella fue asesora de la Asamblea Constituyente irlandesa, de manera que conoció el proceso irlandés, que es el más reciente de los que hemos estudiado, conoció el proceso irlandés muy de cerca. Entonces Rachel va a hacer una presentación de entre 15 a 20 minutos y luego de eso tendremos los comentarios, en primer lugar, del profesor Sergio Verdugo, de la Universidad del Desarrollo, y luego de nuestro profesor Diego Pardo de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Chile. Esta sesión va a ser en inglés y ustedes pueden cambiarse al canal que tiene la traducción al español. De manera que les voy a pedir a quienes tengan problemas para seguir la sesión en inglés que se cambien al canal en español. So we can switch from now on into English, and we welcome very warmly the presence of Rachel Walsh. We are very glad, Rachel, to have you here with us. We had last week one or two conversations, and it was very interesting, and we are sure that we shall be able to learn a lot from your thoughts and your experience in the Irish Constituent Assembly process. So thank you very much, and please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Guillermo, and to all of you for having me here. It's a very interesting moment to speak to you all in Chile about constitutional reform and involving citizens in processes of constitutional reform. It's lovely as an academic to be able to see the practical impact of our work in constitutional law. So thank you for having me. As Guillermo mentioned, I'm an assistant professor here at Trinity, but I also was privileged to be appointed to the expert advisory group of our Citizens Assembly, which worked from 2016 to 2018 on a number of issues of constitutional reform. So I'll speak to you today in my capacity as an academic, not as a representative of that assembly, but very much drawing on and hopefully sharing with you some of my experience and learning from that process. So what I hope to do in the brief time today is to give you, first of all, an overview of the experiment that Ireland has been involved in really since 2012 in involving citizens in our processes of constitutional reform in new and innovative ways. And then I'll focus on two themes arising out of that experience. The first being the political context that led to those innovations and the political response to those innovations. And the second, I suppose the wider social engagement between the Deliberative Assembly and the community at large about constitutional reform and what we can say about its impact. But I hope very much that what I say will spark further questions and thoughts from the panelists and from the attendees, and I look forward to addressing other issues as they arise thereafter. So I suppose most basically, constitutional change in Ireland happens via referendum. We have a constitution enacted in 1937, and in order for it to be changed, first of all, a proposal for an amendment has to be passed by both of our houses of the Oireachtas, those are our houses of parliament. And then it is put to the people by referendum, and a simple majority of those voting in the referendum can effect a change to our constitution. And in our system politically, the government usually, although not always, holds a legislative majority. So ordinarily, the government can table an amendment to the constitution, which is put to the people in a referendum and passed or rejected. So we've had a long history of direct citizen engagement in constitutional change. But since 2012, Ireland has introduced an additional layer of citizen involvement through bringing together small groups of citizens randomly selected to learn about constitutional issues, to deliberate about and discuss those issues, and to make recommendations for change to our houses of parliament and government. And we've had a sequence of 3 of those exercises: a constitutional convention in 2012. The most high profile recommendation coming out of that process was that the constitution should be changed to allow for same-sex marriage. And that was put to the people and adopted by referendum. But that convention made a wide array of other constitutional reform recommendations as well. We then had, between 2016 and 2018, the Citizens' Assembly that I was involved with. Again, one lead or high profile issue, and that was constitutional reform on the issue of abortion in Ireland. And again, the proposal that emerged from that process filtered through a political process and was ultimately accepted by the people through referendum in 2018. And at the moment, and in fact, restarting post-COVID this coming Saturday, is a Citizens' Assembly on gender equality, including how the Constitution can be reformed in various ways to better meet modern day requirements in relation to gender equality. So that assembly began in January 2020, but paused due to COVID-19, and is now, for the first time, restarting in a wholly online format on Saturday. So anybody who's interested can actually follow the live proceedings of our current Citizens' Assembly online Saturday and ongoing thereafter. So if you just Google that, you'll be able to find it. So we're still engaged in this process, and the various iterations of the assemblies have dealt with a mixture of constitutional and non-constitutional issues, but have all followed roughly the same format. So randomly selected citizens brought together to learn from experts, deliberate and vote on constitutional reform recommendations. Each body was established by a parliamentary resolution and was required to report to our Houses of Parliament, and in some cases to specially established parliamentary committees. That was the case in relation to abortion, also in relation to climate change, and now in relation to gender. And in each case, the government specifically undertook to give a formal response to the recommendations emanating from these bodies, which were government appointed, in the sense that the chair of each body was appointed by government, and a secretariat taken from our civil service was established to support each body. And there was an interesting evolution in the makeup of these bodies. The first Constitutional Convention had direct political involvement. So there were 33 out of 100 members of the first convention who were elected politicians. So each political party, in proportion to their numbers in Parliament, was given a number of places, a number of seats at the Assembly, and could appoint participant politicians to the Assembly. And the remaining 100, the remaining makeup of the 100 were randomly selected. In contrast, the Citizens' Assembly that dealt with abortion and our current Assembly on gender do not involve any direct participation from politicians. So a move away in the Irish process from direct political involvement in the deliberative process. However, what we have seen is a coupling or connecting of these deliberative bodies with formal political processes. And that has been through requiring reports to be issued to parliamentary committees, who then consider the recommendations that the citizens make in a lot of detail, and that process then feeds into the legislative process. So running alongside all of this, very importantly, is also a public submissions process that facilitates wider engagement with the community, whereby all members of the public can make submissions on the relevant constitutional issues to the citizens who are deliberating on the constitutional reform questions. So in total so far, these processes have generated a total of 28 constitutional reform recommendations, 3 of which have been adopted by the people following referendum. 1 other recommendation was put to the people, that was to reduce the age of candidacy for the office of president from its current position at 35 to 21, and that was rejected at referendum. So 4 have made it through the political hurdles to referendum, and 3 out of those 4 recommendations were accepted by the people. So I suppose that raises 2 further questions. The first is, well, what prompted the Irish political culture to make this move, if you like, to hand over a degree of influence, at least, around the initiation of referendums to ordinary citizens deliberating in this way. And really the explanation for that is highly political. So each of our 3 citizen engagements in constitutional reform have a largely political backdrop to them, around the mediation of disagreement amongst politicians about constitutional reform. So our first constitutional convention was established in response to disagreement at government formation amongst potential coalition partners about whether or not the constitution should be amended in relation to same-sex marriage. So as a means of navigating that political disagreement as part of the coalition talks, an agreement was reached to set up a citizen engagement body. And similarly, in relation to abortion, we can trace the establishment of the citizen process to the process of government formation. The minority government that undertook to hold the Assembly in part did so as a means of garnering support from independent politicians to get the minority needed to form a minority government. And indeed, our current ongoing Gender Equality Assembly has a similar backdrop against political disagreement. The Constitutional Convention that met in 2012 recommended amending our constitution, which currently specifically recognises the special place of women in the home, to a gender-neutral recognition of the value of caring work. And the government would have preferred to simply delete that provision from the Constitution rather than replacing it with constitutional protection for caring work. And a parliamentary committee was formed to consider that issue, and it recommended that a citizens' assembly could be formed to look at that issue. So in each instance, we can see the primary explanation for the deliberative component in the constitutional reform process really coming out of political disagreement about specific issues in respect of constitutional reform. And I think that reflects a key theme that I would, like anyone hearing about the Irish experience, to take away, which is that political support for this process is key in terms of understanding its impact. Our deliberative bodies have had no direct power to change the Constitution. All that they have been able to do is make recommendations to political bodies. Those political bodies were required to consider those recommendations carefully and respond publicly to them, but ultimately impact in terms of direct constitutional change turned on political impetus to support the recommendations of these bodies. But I think it's clear that these deliberative processes influenced how politicians approached the issue of constitutional reform. They allowed a much wider range of perspectives than would otherwise have been considered ordinarily in relation to constitutional change to be considered. They lengthened the process in the lead up to a constitutional referendum and allowed politicians time to gauge public opinion and how public opinion was evolving on these issues. And we can see, if you like, a freeing effect for politicians in the fact that, for example, on the very contentious issue of abortion, our two largest political parties allowed a free vote on that issue, which wouldn't ordinarily have been the case. So that's really what we can see in terms of the political context and political response to these recommendations. In terms of the wider public then, how can we gauge the level of engagement with this process and the impact on the wider public? In terms of engagement, I think very important that all of these bodies adopted a very transparent approach. So, for example, their proceedings were live streamed on YouTube, and all of the materials, the expert papers and expert presentations that the citizens had access to were made available online, and indeed are still available online for anyone who's interested, so that anybody in the public could inform themselves on these issues of constitutional reform in the same way as the 100 citizens who were selected for the deliberative processes could. So that level of transparency was key. I think additionally, transparency around procedures, for example, the criteria that were used to select speakers, the criteria that were used to structure and inform the discussions that citizens had, for instance, all of those processes were made available to the wider public. In addition, the various deliberative processes provided a platform for NGOs and advocacy groups to channel their interest and influence in constitutional change in a different way, I think, and also for the personal stories of individuals around contentious constitutional issues to be aired and articulated to the wider community. That was a very significant factor in the abortion referendum here, and now in the context of gender equality, there is a lot of emphasis on using the deliberative process to allow personal experiences to be shared with the wider community. So I think that was an important aspect of wider engagement. And obviously in this day and age, social media was a very significant factor in how the wider community could engage with the various deliberative processes, and also media coverage. So there was very extensive media coverage, in particular on the issue of abortion and the various deliberations of the Assembly on that issue were closely scrutinised in the media. In terms of impact then on the wider public, that's more difficult to pinpoint. So, for example, on the issue of abortion, an exit poll in the referendum on abortion here indicated a high level of awareness amongst citizens of the deliberative process and the work that it had done. So 66% of people polled said that they were aware of the existence of the Assembly and had a good understanding of what it had done. And subsequent research has indicated that people were more likely to vote yes, to vote in favour of change, where they were aware of the work of the deliberative process. So all of that would suggest that it was an influential force or factor in respect of constitutional change in Ireland. On the other hand, the same poll asked people what had caused them to vote in a particular way in the referendum, and only 1% of those polled attributed their vote to this deliberative process. So I think in terms of pinpointing the direct influence of such a process on an outcome in a constitutional referendum, it's quite challenging to do that because of the array of factors that influence how people vote and how their opinion on a particular constitutional issue may evolve over time. More subtly, however, I think we can see a value to these processes in terms of ensuring that public debate in the context of a constitutional referendum is rational, informed, and civilised, and indeed that the outcome of a referendum has wide acceptance and perhaps an enhanced sense of legitimacy amongst the community. It's impossible to say that these processes caused that kind of response in the Irish context, but certainly to take the example of abortion, previous referendums on the issue in Ireland had been very contentious and fractious. In contrast, the 2018 amendment was by any read of the situation the result of a campaign that was quite rational and informed, and the outcome was accepted throughout the community when change was voted for in the referendum. So I think easy answers in terms of how citizen engagement in constitutional reform can change outcomes in constitutional processes are hard to come by, but there are certainly an array of plausible readings of the Irish experience that suggest that our processes did have an influence on constitutional change in Ireland, but certainly one that cannot be considered without attending to the political context and the degree of political support that there was for addressing the various constitutional issues. And I think that lesson is brought home when we look back at the numbers. 28 recommendations on constitutional change, only 3 implemented. So that indicates that there can be a significant gap between what is proposed by citizens through these kinds of deliberative exercises and the actual change that ultimately results. And that may be positive or a negative of our experience, depending on one's perspective, but it's certainly an important part of the picture. So I'm very conscious that I'm more interested to hear about what you all think and want to know more about. So I will stop there and cede the floor now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. Very interesting introductory remarks. So we shall now switch to Sergio. So please take the floor, and we don't have many questions yet from the public, but we have several questions between Sergio, Diego, and myself. So at the end of Diego's presentation, if there are no questions, we can continue discussing among ourselves, okay? Sergio, please.
Thank you very much, Guillermo, for the invitation, and thank you, Rachel, for the presentation. I think that the Irish experience is very interesting, and these citizens' assemblies are kind of trendy in the literature right now, but we know so little about them. So having you discussing this item with us is really appreciated. Thank you for that. So when I was preparing for this presentation, I was reading the procedural rules that one of the citizens' assembly had. And the first Citizens' Assembly, at least in the first report of the Constitution, in Article 8 said that voting, if required, shall be by secret ballot. And there's a discussion now in Chile about the levels of transparency that this procedure should have. And I think there's some agreement among certain sectors that having confidential sessions in closed groups can impair the legitimacy of the process, but that it could also be important to trigger good, deep negotiations, right? When political rivals can understand the limits of the adversary. So I wanted to ask you if you can elaborate a little bit more on how the secret ballot was implemented, if was implemented at all, maybe change it afterwards, and if it helped actually to trigger certain agreements, bipartisan agreements that otherwise would not have been triggered. That's my first question. So my second question is, I still don't understand why a government that has majority in both houses of parliaments could be interested in doing that if for changing the constitution they only need to achieve simple majority and then referendum. What is the political explanation for that? It seems to me that the results of the Citizens' Assembly are not that predictable as the ones of referendums, for example. Maybe I'm wrong in the case of Ireland. I understand Ireland is a Catholic country, right? So discussing issues as abortion and same-sex marriage, it can trigger a lot of controversy, and maybe politicians were not expecting to have the recommendations they got afterward. So how and why politicians can trust the process? What is the key for that? Is it in the control of the agenda of the convention? Maybe in the way they frame the questions? Also, politicians retain some sort of veto power, right? Because if the Citizens' Assembly enacts certain recommendations and then politicians in the Congress don't want to put them in the referendum, then the process is completely blocked, right? But is this something that politicians can justify publicly, not to held the referendums? I understand that certain recommendations have not been yet submitted to a public referendum. What is the explanation for that, or it's just a matter of time? So another question that I have is, what is the advantage of citizens' assemblies over referendum, right? So one common criticism against referendums is that they offer too closed alternatives and there's no space for getting a middle ground solution that can promote bipartisan agreements. Citizens' Assembly seems to have the potential to solve this, right? To have the citizens deliberating, to find a middle ground. So my question is, are the recommendations reflecting these bipartisan agreements? Are the recommendations finding a common ground? Is this something that is interesting for the deliberation itself? Another question that I have, Guillermo, please tell me when to stop. I have many questions really. Another question that I have is how to measure the deliberation. How have you measured the deliberation of the convention? So there are two possible ways of assessing the deliberation, right? The internal deliberation and the external deliberation. If you take into account the internal deliberation, I guess that it would be relevant to assess what the initial positions of the citizens are, and then compare them with the final decisions made by the citizens. Have you noticed, if possible, if there's any research on this, whether there are actual changes in their positions? And if you compare the citizens' voting behavior with the politicians' voting behavior in the mixed assembly, right, because they were both in the mixed assembly, did you notice differences in the way they changed their positions comparing citizens with politicians? We can emphasize maybe that politicians had a more rigid views, but I'm not sure if that is true. Another way to see deliberation is the external deliberation, right? The capacity that the Citizens Convention will have to lead the discussion in the public, like with the media, with politicians. Has there any research about that in the way the positions of the public have changed because of the Citizens Assembly? Maybe there are polls taken before the Citizens Assembly took place and after the Citizens Assembly took place that can help us. Of course, we have the referendum, right? How did a majority of Irish Catholics moderated their views on abortion? And maybe that's something interesting to ask. Another thing that I wanted to ask is that there's a problem of self-selection when you randomize the citizens that appear to the that are elected to the convention, right? Because citizens can say no, and you will expect citizens that are more biased or more self-interested to actually say yes to. So, are there any solutions to this problem or any design that you would recommend to trigger help this? And just one last question. I'm sorry, there's so many questions. Is, so when in the mixed assembly, when you have politicians sitting together along with the citizens, you could maybe think that politicians will dominate the convention, right? They have more political experience. They are probably more protected against lobbyist groups. They have all these parties protecting them. So are there any evidence of this happening, like of citizens actually being undermined by the voices of dominant politicians? Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe you could think that citizens have more legitimacy than politicians in this way, and they may exclude them. And if that didn't happen, either of these two alternatives of dominant positions controlling the agenda, how did that happen? So I read a paper that interviewed some of the citizens after the convention, and one of the citizens said something that was kind of interesting. It says that when they gathered together in a hotel in Dublin every weekend, and like after some time, they could actually know each other more, and this helped to build the ground for them to be more equals in the process. I wondered whether, if this is true, I'm not sure if this is generalizable, it's just the testimony of one person. But if this is true and generalizable, do you think that using these kinds of assemblies in our COVID era, right, with Zoom, with or other alternatives to gather via electronic, can impair the need for people, for the delegates to actually gather and build the ground for agreements, know each other? I will leave it here. Thank you very much, Rachel.
Okay, thank you, Sergio. A lot
so
of questions. And let's first move to Diego's comments and questions, and we can then come back to you. Okay, Diego, please.
I'm not sure if we are going to run out of time if I speak too much. So I would rather hear what Rachel wants to say. I just want to add two issues that are rather complementary of what Sergio just said. One is, how is your experience of, so Sergio asked whether kind of professional politicians were able to bend the original understanding of these citizens. There's another side of that coin, that is whether the citizens were subject to some sort of harassment or shove or scrutinized by social media or maybe their neighbors or something like that. And that, I think it's particularly interesting for our experience, since Irish experience is probably one of the few constitutional assemblies that have taken place in a social media era. And probably social media is going to change a lot of the way that we interact politically. So the potential effect of social media, particularly the harassment coming out of social media, might have been something interesting, and maybe you can expand on that. My second point is probably the opposite, is, and Sergio built on that a little bit when he said about whether you think this is possible in Zoom, and on that I would like to this is just your feeling as a member of the advisory committee and somebody that also actually witnessed what happened live on the assemblies, whether you think that the ex-ante position of the members of the committee evolved during their interaction with people that actually thought differently on the topic, whether this kind of polarization was sort of tamed by the social interaction and actually being able to put a face to a different position and maybe learn the story behind those positions. Those two things, whether social media harassment was something important, and whether the physical interaction of citizens made something on the probably ex-ante polarization of the political positions. And thank you so much, Rachel, for being with us, and this has been a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Please go ahead, and then we can move to other questions, which we are now receiving.
Okay, thanks so much for all those really interesting comments, and I'll try and whiz through them as efficiently as I can. So, Sergio, you first asked about voting by secret ballot, and yes, votes were by secret ballot, and really the abortion issue was so high stakes, and I suppose there was fairly clear acceptance that if the Assembly recommended a referendum, that the government would follow through on that recommendation. Everybody was aware of that. The stakes were so high that, in fact, we brought in professionals from the section of our civil service that would ordinarily look after the administration of elections to run the secret ballot process in the Assembly, so that there was a very formal balloting process that would have been equivalent to what you would do at a polling station, and that was supervised independently by individuals with expertise in that area in the Assembly from 2016 to 2018, because that issue was perceived as being so high stakes. If there was any question over the integrity of the actual vote, that would have been very problematic. But I think the general question that you pose on that about the balance between transparency as a means of ensuring public confidence in the process and underpinning the legitimacy of the process, publicity as a means of ensuring all of that, and at the same time the need for essential pockets of confidentiality is really is a really important point, and one where, you know, getting the balance right is always going to be tricky, but I think you do need both elements. So we had confidential, closed roundtable sessions where the citizens could have opportunities for individual reflection, could discuss with each other privately how their views were evolving, what they felt in terms of reactions to expert presentations, etc. And we balanced those with holding all of the other sessions publicly. And when I say publicly, I mean they were live streamed and people could apply for reasons of space to be observers, to come and sit in the room where this was taking place. And examples of the public sessions would have included where you had experts coming in to address the citizens on issues of law, ethics, the medical information around abortion, etc. And the questions and answer sessions, crucially, between the experts and the citizens were held publicly. And those were very informative in terms of the direction of thinking of the citizens, because you could learn a lot from how the citizens were questioning experts in terms of how their thinking on the issues were evolving. So I think you have to have both. You have to have a balance, but I would say as much publicity and transparency as is possible while maintaining that privacy around deliberations is probably necessary, because certainly the previous convention from 2012 had been criticised, including by some academics, for not being transparent enough around some issues. For instance, what criteria were used to select experts to come and speak. So learning from that, the 2016-2018 procedure tried in as much as was possible to be as transparent and public as possible, while recognising that the citizens did need a space that was safe and private and confidential within the process to do their deliberations. Why would government be interested in it then? Well, I think, as I said, each of our iterations of these deliberative processes has a political rationale, which was ensuring buy-in from coalition partners and providing really a means of delaying dealing with a constitutional issue for a while that was hard to broker agreement on amongst politicians. So there was that political rationale for each of these iterations. I think, I suppose, possibly more fundamentally, there was political support in each context for the particular constitutional issue, at least the headline constitutional issue, to be addressed. So there was a lack of political consensus on how to approach the constitutional issue, but there was an agreement that it had to be dealt with. So there was buy-in to coming to some resolution of the process, but a lack of clarity as to how to broker agreement about the way forward. And this was a tool that was used to thrash out, I guess, alternative approaches to the issue, details around the issue, to get expert information about the issue on the table, and to give people time to think about the issue and reflect on public opinion and where that was going on the issue. But I think you're absolutely right that results from citizens' assemblies aren't always going to be as predictable as referendums. I think certainly the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly on abortion took politicians by surprise. So the Assembly issued its recommendations in April of 2017. And at that moment in time, its recommendations were significantly more liberal than opinion polls at that moment in time. So the citizens recommended that abortion should be available on request up to 12 weeks without any restriction as to reasons through local community healthcare. And that was much more liberal than the political consensus at the time and the kinds of opinions that were emerging through polls at the time. So I think that certainly caught the politicians by surprise. But Ultimately, that is more or less the regime that we have now. So another year passed between the time of those recommendations and the referendum. The recommendations received considerable debate, were the subject of considerable debate and publicity through a parliamentary committee that considered those recommendations. And if you track the opinion polls over the course of the 2018 year, you can see public opinion evolving in a more liberal direction, so that ultimately the constitutional referendum is passed by a significant majority and is passed against the backdrop of draft legislation that undertakes to bring in this much more liberal regime. So, there's an interesting pattern there where you have recommendations coming from the deliberative body that seem ahead of public opinion, and public opinion then ultimately matching, as reflected in the referendum, the recommendations of the Assembly. But I think you're right, politicians can be surprised. Agenda control, you mentioned, and I think that is a big factor. Certainly in the Irish context, the establishment of these bodies is controlled by the politicians. The issues that they consider is controlled by the politicians. The budget, all of the resourcing comes from central government. So there's a lot of elite control of the process as it has been implemented in the Irish context. That said, the agenda is controlled, if you like, at a headline issue, at a headline level. So the citizens were told, for instance, to consider climate change, to consider abortion, to consider any necessary changes around the referendum process, just to take some examples. So the agenda was given to the citizens, but in quite general terms. Under the rubric of those issues, the citizens had a lot of freedom to influence the issues that were discussed, the kind of information that they considered, and ultimately the recommendations that they issued. So, for example, each time they met, they were asked through surveys to give feedback on whether they thought there were issues that needed to be covered, what issues they thought they would like to make recommendations on, etc. So there was a lot of evolving and rolling citizen input into the agenda, but ultimately the questions to be considered were set by government. And can politicians justify not proceeding with these recommendations? Well, whether they can justify it or not, they certainly have ignored, ultimately, a lot of the recommendations from the Irish Constitutional Convention and the Citizens' Assembly. So, really, it again comes back to that question of the political standing of the issue. The headline issues, the convention, same-sex marriage, the Assembly, abortion, those were issues where it was clear the government wasn't going to ignore the recommendations emerging from those processes, because they were already high-profile issues, at the centre of public debate, that everybody recognised needed to be tackled. They were coming before the courts in various forms of litigation, and were at the centre of public debate. I suppose around those headline issues were very important, but in terms of political stakes at the moment in time, more marginal issues. And on those issues, you have seen a whole array of government responses. Some recommendations have been ignored entirely. Some recommendations have been redirected to parliamentary committees or to departmental reviews for further consideration and further debate. And indeed, one issue, the status in the Constitution of women in the home, was addressed by the Constitutional Convention in 2012 and is now being considered again by the Citizens' Assembly on gender equality. So I suppose within that you can see a whole array of government responses stretching from completely ignoring them to putting them to the people in a referendum and them ultimately being adopted. Certainly successive governments have been criticised for failing to respond to recommendations or for shunting recommendations into further parliamentary consideration rather than directly addressing them. But ultimately, these recommendations are advisory, and unless the political stakes are very high, they can ultimately be ignored. Then advantages over referendums. I can really only speak to the Irish experience directly, where we have coupled them with referendums, and there, yes, you can certainly see an advantage in terms of, ordinarily the government would just table the referendum proposal, and there would be very little debate about what the referendum question should look like. The people would have a say in voting yes or no in that binary way, but very little opportunity for input at an earlier stage. And I think our experience has been that the process of allowing citizen and indeed expert input, NGO advocacy group input at the pre-initiation stage has been a valuable one. So certainly coupled with the referendum, I think you can see advantages coming through in that respect. And then you made some very interesting points, Sergio, about measuring deliberation and how to measure deliberation. Unfortunately, we have a big gap in research here, in that there was no political science research done to track that evolution in attitudes over the course of the Assembly, which was definitely an opportunity lost. And when you look back, you can see that there was surveying done in terms of how happy the citizens were with the process week to week. So did they feel their voices were being heard? Did they feel the expert material was accessible, etc.? And all of that was very positive and consistently positive. So it suggests, the design in deliberative terms of the process was pretty good and working well, but we don't have the information that it would be really fascinating to have in terms of that shift in attitudes, either internally or externally, unfortunately. You mentioned self-selection and questions of representation. Absolutely. I mean, a huge problem, and I think a big weakness we can see in the process is deficiencies in representativeness. Okay, the big argument is that citizen input in this format into constitutional change is legitimate if it is representative of the public at large and deliberatively robust. And I think we can say with reasonable confidence that the Irish processes were deliberatively robust. That is borne out in the feedback from the citizens. But in terms of representativeness, there are bigger questions. So we had random selection by reference to sex, geography, age, and socioeconomic status. So the idea was that the makeup of the body would be representative along those four factors. But exactly as you say, the self-selection aspect to it meant that it was clear that there was an over-representation of people from higher socioeconomic groupings with a better education. And there was an underrepresentation of rural communities, for instance. So one adjustment that was made in the process for the Gender Equality Assembly was to bring in a payment for citizens, so a stipend. Not a huge payment, but that there would be a financial recognition for each contribution that they make, in the hopes of encouraging, a wider spectrum of people to opt in, rather than simply people who, as you say, were motivated and self-selecting out of interest. So no, I think there's a lot of work that can be done around enhancing the representative nature of the makeup of these bodies, and our process certainly wasn't perfect in any way on those metrics. In terms of the mixed assembly, did politicians dominate? The evidence is no. So David Farrell and some other political scientists have a very interesting paper on that you can access. And their hypothesis was, as you suggest, that there would be domination. And there was some evidence that politicians tended to speak more often than non-politician members, but that wasn't received as or perceived as domination by the other participants. And in fact, some of the feedback was that, particularly on some of the issues that the convention dealt with in 2012 were around parliamentary reform, electoral processes, voting, etc. They valued the expertise and experience that politicians had in considering those issues. So the evidence thus far is that there wasn't domination. The thinking behind having politicians involved was that you would guarantee buy-in from the get-go by having politicians directly involved. Really, when it came to 2016, 2018, the perception is that no politicians wanted to be directly involved in discussions around abortion reform because that was so contentious. So the move has been away from having direct involvement of politicians through mixed membership. But the political science research on that mixed membership is reasonably positive in terms of that question of domination. And then the social dimension, and Diego, you referenced this as well. I mean, it's having been in the room and involved in the process over 6 months. It's a huge challenge, I think, to move this process wholly online. All people are different, but certainly you could see that the social dimension was extremely important to the participants in the process, getting to know each other, talking over coffee, talking over lunch, all of those informal discussions. We'll never know what impact they had, but I think it's safe to say that cumulatively over the course of 18 months for some of the citizens, that absolutely had an impact. And again, as I said, there's no research on shifts in attitudes, but I think anecdotally, as an observer, you could certainly see, as you put it, kind of any polarization in attitudes very much being softened in the room through those day-to-day interactions, through hearing other people's perspectives and being required to reflect on them. So, I mean, I wouldn't like to suggest that it's impossible to do it online, and it'll be really interesting to see how the Irish process now evolves in an online format, but it'll be very different in terms of the lack of interpersonal interactions. I think the hope is that by 2021, there will be the opportunity for the members to come together on the Gender Equality Assembly and have interpersonal deliberations before they make their recommendations. But who knows, that the situation is evolving so quickly. So the final point then from Diego to pick up was in relation to harassment, social media, all of that. Absolutely, social media was a factor. It would be an even bigger factor now because, again, its influence has increased again since the time of, for instance, the abortion referendum. I suppose one significant rule that we laid down was that citizens were asked to refrain from publicly commenting on their work for the duration of the deliberative process in order to try to guard against any of that, I suppose, spiraling or escalating social media harassment. And that did prove largely successful. We didn't have any big problems with it. And as I indicated to you when we were talking last week, there was a degree of protection around the identities. So their names were released and the general areas in which they lived, but no narrower identifying information such as addresses or age or things like that. So yes, it was a concern and a consideration, but it didn't materialize in any very concrete problems in the Irish experience. But that's not to say it couldn't in a different context, I think. So I should leave it there in case there are more questions from the attendees.
So thank you so much, Rachel. I do have two questions. one that is on the Q&A. I think you answered already, but I will just ask you anyway if you want to add something. So the concern of Leonardo in the audience is that elite members of the citizen assembly will dominate the discussion in comparison with less professionally trained members of the assembly. I think you kind of answered that for professional politicians, but maybe you want to evaluate whether it's true for all professionals. And the other one that is not in the Q&A, but it was sent by some other means, is regarding the advisory committee and how the Irish experience achieved kind of neutral experts. How were you able to create an advisory committee that was perceived as rather neutral in such a polarized debate?
Let me add some other questions that came to me privately, I don't know why, but one by Juan Diego Galás. He's requesting your view on to what extent social movements should eventually have some right to recall a citizens' assembly, some kind of direct democracy instrument. Is this in your view, can this become a kind of direct democracy instrument, or do you feel it more comfortable with the current status? Pablo Fensalida, he makes 3 questions. I believe those are basically have been answered but the third one, I would think it's interesting. He says, can you tell us if citizens have been more concerned about constitutional rights or regarding governance? What's the main issue there? Then Fabiana Choca, she asks 2 questions. Why only 4 out of 28 recommendations have been voted by referendum? You already referred to this eventually because you mentioned that some advice were ignored, but anyway, what's your view on the referendum, the use of referendum? And then I presume Constanza Catalan, it has already been answered your question because she's asking whether you were creating a new constitution or basically reforming it, but I believe that was already answered. And then I have a couple of questions on my side. In Chile, some people disagree with the idea of calling to a convention, and we need to take that decision in 10 days, because they say that it provides some illegitimacy to the parliament itself. So it's a kind of trade-off. We have a lot of mistrust with the parliament, and to what extent the assembly will erode even further that illegitimacy. So that's one question. Okay. Yeah, and the other thing is, I believe you answered it, but anyway, where the assembly got some kind of very broad terms of reference, so to speak, or not, as we have had quite several of them. Eventually, in some cases, were very broad, and other more narrow. So, can you speak about the narrowness or broadness?
Thanks, Guillermo, and to everyone for those questions. All really interesting, and it's always interesting to hear what other people find striking or interesting about your own experience, particularly when you've been very close to it. It always casts it in a different light. I think the first question was around elite influence. And I mean, I could talk about that question of balancing citizen control and citizen input with elite influence for days. I think it is very much at the heart of a lot of the challenge of structuring these kinds of processes. And as an expert involved in the organization of our assembly, I was certainly acutely conscious all the time of trying to check myself and check what we were doing to make sure that we were at least trying to get that balance right between empowering the citizens with information, but ultimately allowing them to control the direction of travel of their own thinking and their own recommendations. But I would not in any way purport to suggest that we got it right, perfect, all the time across the board, because I think, anybody designing and implementing these kinds of processes will have to make a lot of trade-offs between these two considerations: how much expert input is required to make the process meaningful, and how much citizen control and citizen input can be maintained within that. I suppose in the Irish context, we had, certainly in relation to abortion, a very legalistic and legally complex issue. And it was clear that the government wanted an answer, a proposal on it. So that meant that there was the need for, significant expert support in setting up the work programme, giving the citizens the information that they needed, and structuring things in such a way as would allow a recommendation to emerge that would be legally practicable in a relatively narrow time frame. I think we were helped by time because the deliberations on abortion stretched over a 6-month period. And that meant that citizens had a lot of time to reflect on the expert information that they were receiving. But, huge risks in terms of elite domination. You have an expert group designing the agenda, designing the work programme with citizen input, but still with that elite influence there. You have experts coming in to present to the citizens, and I suppose another feature of the Irish bodies was that you had some exclusions from the citizenry to try to protect against manipulation. So the Assembly excluded politicians from being directly involved, as I mentioned. It also excluded members of advocacy groups from being voting participants. And interestingly also excluded journalists. And I was never quite clear why that was the case, but I think it was to protect the confidentiality of the proceedings and avoid any leaks. So there were various measures taken to try to mitigate elite influence. Citizens, as I mentioned, were surveyed every weekend on what they wanted to hear and on their concerns. There was a steering group of citizens elected by themselves, which liaised directly with the chair in terms of providing input into the agenda. And that. So every effort was made to get the balance right, but absolutely, the risk of elite influence, elite bias, and domination is one that you can't take away, I think. I suppose that links then to the question around the expert advisory group and how did we get neutral experts? I mean, can you ever have neutral experts? But the criteria that were used in appointing to the expert advisory group were obviously expertise, but that the experts in question hadn't publicly commented on the specific issue of abortion in any contentious way. So you had constitutional law experts, but we just happened to be ones who hadn't published on the issue of abortion. Similarly, doctors who were very expert in fields of obstetrics, but hadn't been politically active around the issue. And there was a medical lawyer, a medical ethicist and lawyer, again, who hadn't publicly commented, and a political scientist. And that was the makeup of the expert advisory group. And as I said, selected for expertise, but also for lack of public comment on the issue. And that was criticised. Obviously, there was a lot of great expertise on the issue that was to a certain degree excluded from the process by virtue of that prioritisation of neutrality. And that was a point of criticism of the Assembly. But I think the perception was that the issue of abortion had been so fractious and contentious in the past that neutrality and impartiality was the most important consideration to be borne in mind in expert selection in that context. And that carried through to identifying experts who would come to speak to the citizens on particular topics. Insofar as was possible, we selected speakers who weren't advocates on the topic and asked them to give presentations that were information focused rather than advocacy presentations where possible. Should social movements have the right to call a citizens' assembly? It's a really interesting question, and interestingly, both our Constitutional Convention and our Citizens' Assembly recommended that our constitution should be amended to provide for greater direct democracy. So both bodies argued that there should be a facility for citizen initiative in relation to legislative reform and constitutional reform. So that idea of direct democracy was one that was very appealing to citizens in two consecutive deliberative bodies, but not a recommendation that received political support. One of those sets of recommendations that have languished on the shelves. So, I mean, I think certainly social movements both contributed to and benefited from both of these deliberative democracy exercises, particularly around abortion. A significant degree of the impetus for the Assembly was a very active pro-choice movement in Ireland, very active NGO and advocacy groups that had put pressure on successive governments such that the issue was squarely on the table at government formation, and that very much fed into the Assembly being established. So I think you can see, emerging evidence of social movements, NGOs, advocacy groups, identifying these mechanisms as potentially useful in advancing constitutional reform agendas and thinking about how to use them effectively, I think. Were the citizens more concerned with constitutional rights or governance? The interesting example to think about on this is the Constitutional Convention of 2012. So one difference that I didn't mention, and it is important, between that first Constitutional Convention and our two successive citizens' assemblies was that the first convention had a limited degree of control over its own agenda. So it had a list of issues that were given to it in its terms of reference to be considered, but it was also allowed to consider other issues of its own volition. In contrast, the two subsequent citizens' assemblies had no independent agenda setting power, and I think that is an important difference between them. So in that first Constitutional Convention, interestingly, the two issues that the citizens themselves chose to consider were, number one, amending our constitution to protect economic, social and cultural rights, which currently aren't protected in our constitution, and number two, parliamentary reform. So they chose an issue of rights and an issue of governance. both very big and complex topics, and made recommendations on one of each of rights and governance. So it's very hard to say which they were more interested in or more concerned with. That would suggest that there was an appetite amongst citizens to deal with both questions of structure and governance and questions of rights. Why then were only 4 out of 28 recommendations voted on? A really interesting question, and a degree of speculation necessarily entailed in my answer. But if you look at the pattern of recommendations where there was political take-up, you can see some patterns emerging. Certainly, the successive governments have proven reluctant to move forward recommendations that had financial implications, spending implications. So, for instance, economic, social and cultural rights, amending the constitution to provide protection for carers. Those recommendations didn't see political uptake. The recommendations that involved, I suppose, complex amendments to the constitution or unpredictable changes to the constitution also were ones that there wasn't political support for. And as I mentioned, recommendations around citizen initiative, direct democracy, which would have ultimately diluted the power of government and the legislative majority, also didn't receive support. So a lack of political support really is why only 4 out of 28 recommendations were put to the people, because in the Irish system, you have to have legislative initiation of any referendum bill. So you need that political buy-in to get the question from the deliberative assembly to the referendum stage, and only a limited number of issues garnered that political support in the Irish context. Our assemblies weren't shortcuts around representative democracy. They didn't have themselves the power to put the issue on the referendum agenda of their own volition. Then I suppose the interesting question of, could a convention be understood to delegitimize Parliament and erode trust in Parliament? And it's related to that point. The Irish experience is of an advisory function for deliberative assemblies composed of citizens, rather than those citizen bodies having direct decision-making power. So it's different in that sense that there isn't that sense of in any way usurping or taking away power from representative bodies, but rather, ideally being complementary to and supporting those representative bodies. So I don't think we can really learn any lessons from the Irish experience about whether there could be an eroding of trust or a delegitimizing of formal parliamentary institutions through these kinds of processes. But I think, we can certainly draw the idea from the Irish experience that perhaps, it's argued in deliberative democracy theory that the legitimacy of political processes can be enhanced where you have greater citizen engagement, and certainly nothing in the Irish experience would contradict that view. I wouldn't say that the Irish experience proves that representative democracy and referendum outcomes are enhanced in their legitimacy where you have this kind of direct citizen input, but there's certainly nothing to contradict that deliberative democracy thesis in the Irish experience. And finally then, in relation to terms of reference, yes, as I think I mentioned, each body was established through a parliamentary resolution, and in that parliamentary resolution, the issues to be considered by the Assembly were set out and specified. Not in a huge amount of detail. So, for instance, the Assembly in 2016 was charged with considering reforming the 8th Amendment, and that was the provision in the Constitution that restricted abortion in Ireland. It was further charged with making Ireland a leader in climate change, obviously a very broad assignment, and with considering the challenges of the ageing population and how to respond to the challenges of an ageing population. So the terms of reference were prescribed, but at a very broad level for the most part, leaving a lot of work to be done by the citizens, the chair, the expert advisory group in working out in a more concrete way what the focus should be.
Thank you. Sergio and Diego, would you like to raise some other point? We have 10 minutes left still.
Yes,
Well,
Go ahead, go ahead.
no, please.
no, Sergio, please. Sergio, please.
Yes, I just wanted, thank you very much, Rachel. It's very interesting, everything that you have said. I wonder, I still have questions about how to frame the questions, the number of items that would be advisable to have these conventions discussing, and whether it would be desirable or not to frame the questions in a somehow more open way. If we think about the need to achieve a deep deliberation, right, on a specific issue, my intuition would be to say that it's better to have less questions in number and for the questions to be very, very precise and less open. I wonder whether you can, we can have your views on this.
Diego, do you have something else or? Diego? Yeah.
Yes. I'll go ahead. So I think my final question is I look into the future. So how do you see Ireland going forward with this process? Do you think it will expand it? Do you think it will continue? Do you think it will be restricted? Just see how do you see the future of this particular experience?
Yeah, thanks both of you. In terms of the number of issues and how those issues should be framed, I think I agree with you that a smaller number of issues is better. And that has been rolled into the Irish experience now, I think, in that our current Assembly is only looking at gender equality. Now, within the heading of gender equality, it's looking at a range of subset issues, constitutional reform in relation to gender equality, how to enhance female representation in political life, for example. But there is a continuous theme throughout the Assembly's work around that question of gender equality. So if you like, expertise can be built up by the citizens and taken from topic to topic around that issue, which I think is helpful. And we have seen a progressive narrowing in the number of issues dealt with. The first Constitutional Convention dealt with a very significant number of issues. The Citizens' Assembly dealt with 5 issues, a mixture of constitutional and non-constitutional issues. And this current iteration is just looking at gender equality issues. So I think that is a lesson that we have taken, a smaller number of issues. And as somebody who was in the room, my experience certainly was that where you could spend a significant period of time on the issue, the deliberative process was more meaningful than where, the process was shorter. We had 5 weekends on abortion spread out, as I said, over 6 months. That allowed a lot of time for complex information to be shared with the citizens, for their competencies to be built up around those issues, and for meaningful deliberation. In contrast, I was also involved with the same group on the question of fixed-term parliaments, whether we should amend our constitution to follow the move that has been taken in the UK to have more significant restrictions around the terms of parliaments. That was done over 1 weekend. So it was very compressed. They were getting a huge amount of detailed information, analysing it very quickly, deliberating within a short period of time, and voting on their recommendations the next day. And that just felt very different in terms of the ability of the citizens to take ownership of the issues and the agendas themselves, and to really have a handle on them. So I think, a small number of issues, good periods of time given to them, and proper support around learning and deliberating on those issues is really important to make the process meaningful. Then, Diego, your question around next steps and where this goes. There's been a lot of talk and debate amongst academics here about whether we are moving to institutionalization of this process of citizens' assemblies in Ireland. And there have been various academics here and internationally who have argued that you should have institutionalization, that you should have these bodies on a standing footing, and that helps to avoid political manipulation or elite control of the process for their own purposes. I don't think we're there yet here. It's still very much a pick and choose approach on the part of government as to when these bodies and on what issues these bodies are employed. And from my perspective, I guess as a constitutional scholar, I can't speak for political scientists on this. I don't see a problem with that because our constitutional system requires political support and political buy-in for a referendum to take place anyway. So having citizen deliberation on constitutional issues on an institutional basis where there might be no political support for change could perhaps become an academic exercise. So I think we're going to see these regularly now. Certainly our programme for government for this current coalition government, I'd have to double check the number, but certainly it promised citizens' assemblies on at least 5 topics. So these are going to become recurrent features of the Irish political and constitutional landscape. That said, that was pre-COVID, well, not pre-COVID, but I think before we all realised just how long-term the impact of COVID was going to be in terms of limiting interpersonal interactions. So I think the next 3 months of observing how it works online may well have a big impact on where this goes in Ireland going forward. But for example, the programme for government suggests that there will be a citizens' assembly on biodiversity within the lifetime of this government and how to enhance biodiversity. So a very non-constitutional topic on its face, at least. So we may well see increasing use of these assemblies on public policy issues rather than solely on constitutional issues, I think, may be the next phase.
Okay, great. I believe we are basically running out of time. Do you have any further question? Yeah, Diego, you already discussed.
It's not really a question. Yes, it is a question, but how do we keep up with the news on the Irish experience? Would you recommend some venue to keep it up with the process?
Yeah, so you can follow the Citizens Assembly on Twitter. So it's at Sits Assembly, I think is the handle, but you should be able to find that fairly easily. And if you simply Google Irish Citizens Assembly, you should receive in the Google search links that will take you to each of the iterations. The current one will also direct you back to the 2016-2018 one, and from there you can also find the details on the 2012 convention. Everything is still up online, and you should be able to follow the proceedings of the Gender Equality Assembly live online if you wish this Saturday. So
we shall look for that link and put it on the website for all of you. Rachel, if you were in Santiago now, it's lunchtime, so we would go for a nice lunch with a cup of great Chilean wine. That's not the case, unfortunately, but sure, you can replace the wine for a wonderful Guinness. So, for a very thoughtful presentation, very clear, I think. Thank you, Sergio, for all your questions, very deep, and Diego as well. I will switch now to Spanish for a while. So you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say thank you for really interesting discussions, and to wish you all the very best of luck there with very significant and exciting constitutional endeavours in the month ahead.
Thank you very much. I will switch into Spanish now, Rachel. So, para todos ustedes les comentamos que con este seminario de ahora cerramos el ciclo de procesos constituyentes y vamos a empezar 2 sesiones, desgraciadamente va quedando poco tiempo, 2 sesiones donde vamos a discutir sobre el contrato social. La primera de estas sesiones va a ser el martes de la próxima semana y va a ser el contrato social y desigualdad. Va a haber una presentación de Nora Luz, la destacada académica de la Universidad de Tulane, y va a estar Francisco Gallego, Diego y yo nuevamente como co-hosts. Y en la semana siguiente al plebiscito no habrá actividad, pero en la subsiguiente, la del 3 de noviembre, vamos a hablar sobre nuevamente contrato social y estado de bienestar, y aquí estará como invitado estelar Gösta Sping Andersen, que es uno de los grandes intelectuales del estado de bienestar, para hablar de cómo, en el primer caso, la desigualdad, y en el segundo caso, el estado de bienestar, van formateando, ¿no es cierto?, el contrato social que se materializa en el documento que llamamos Constitución. Diego, ¿quieres decir algo antes de...? ¿No?
Nada, gracias por participar en este seminario. Nos seguiremos viendo con el siguiente ciclo.
Muchas gracias a todos. Muchas gracias, Rachel.
Gracias, Rachel.
Gracias, Sergio.
Gracias, Sergio. Nos vemos.